Tonight we are going somewhere that feels familiar but is actually completely unrecognizable. 1950s America. The cars were beautiful, the diners were gleaming, and somewhere behind all of that chrome and optimism was a country doing things so deeply, profoundly weird that you will genuinely question whether any of this actually happened. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And a huge thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. Your comments shape what we cover, and this channel runs on your curiosity. We are also on Spotify now, so if you prefer to drift off with us in your ears, the link is in the description. Okay. Dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull your blanket up, and get cozy. Let us talk about a decade that told you everything was fine and absolutely nothing was fine. Did entire communities decide collectively and with great enthusiasm to build neighborhoods where every single house looked exactly the same? Yes. They did. Levittown, New York was the most famous example, a planned community of nearly 17,000 identical houses, each with a small yard, a new refrigerator, and a television aerial pointing hopefully toward the sky. The houses were so uniform that men returning home drunk from the bowling alley regularly walked into the wrong one. And more disturbingly, sometimes did not notice for several minutes. This was considered charming. Developer William Levitt essentially applied the logic of the assembly line to house construction. He broke the building process into 27 individual steps and sent teams of specialized workers moving from lot to lot. At peak production, Levitt's teams were completing one new house every 16 minutes. The price was just under $8,000, and veterans could purchase with no money down using the GI Bill. But here is the part they did not put in the brochure. The sameness was not incidental. It was load-bearing. When every house looks the same and every lawn is the same size, the pressure to behave like everyone else is not a rule. It does not need to be a rule. It is simply the air you breathe. Some covenants explicitly barred black families from purchasing homes, a fact that shaped the demographics of American suburbs for decades. In 1950s America, the modern kitchen appliance became one of the clearer signals of middle-class success. Your refrigerator was not just a refrigerator. It was a monument. It was approximately the size of a small bathroom, and your neighbor across the street did not have one this large. And that was the point. By 1955, refrigerators had begun to appear in colors. Pink refrigerators existed. They were purchased enthusiastically. Women's magazines ran features on how to coordinate your kitchen color scheme, which meant that an appliance designed to prevent food from rotting had entered the realm of interior design and was being treated accordingly. The woman in the refrigerator ad was always smiling at the refrigerator. Not at her family, not out the window. At the refrigerator. She was gazing at it with an expression that suggested she had just been reunited with a beloved friend after a long separation. The implicit message was not subtle. This appliance is your reward. You have earned this. What nobody mentioned was that the refrigerator also lengthened the list of things a housewife was expected to produce. Fresh food available meant fresh food expected. The convenience had a way of generating new obligations at approximately the same rate it eliminated old ones. 1950s American food exists in a category best described as aggressively optimistic. A cuisine shaped by food technology, post-war prosperity, and what can only be described as a complete loss of restraint around gelatin. The centerpiece of the modern housewife's dinner party was often a molded salad. A shimmering tower of lime jello containing, and this is real, suspended shredded carrots, cream cheese, olives, and occasionally canned tuna. Set in a ring mold and presented on lettuce with the confidence of someone who had absolutely no doubts about what they were doing. Gelatin could hold things. This apparently was enough. If it could hold shredded carrots in suspension, it was food. If it could hold cream cheese and olives and a brave little piece of celery, it was cuisine. The line between dessert and dinner side dish was treated as optional, and that was apparently completely fine. Then there were TV dinners, which appeared in 1953. A frozen tray compartmentalized into meat, starch, and vegetable. Designed to be eaten in front of the television on a folding tray table, which was also a product you could purchase. The meal was designed around the furniture. This is the most 1950s thing that has ever happened. You are not feeling well, so you make an appointment. When you arrive, the doctor's office smells of something warm and familiar. Cigarette smoke. Because your doctor is currently smoking. This is not concerning. In fact, throughout much of the early 1950s, this is essentially an endorsement. Camel Cigarettes ran a campaign noting that more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. A claim based on a survey the company itself commissioned and conducted with the scientific rigor of a man asking his friends what they thought of his haircut. The advertisement ran anyway. Nobody audited the methodology. 44% of American adults smoked in 1954, and the number was climbing. Cigarettes were handed out at hospitals. Doctors in some advertisements actively recommended specific brands to patients with throat irritation, suggesting that the smooth, mild qualities of their preferred cigarette would be less aggravating than the competition. This was the medical advice you paid for. The science suggesting that cigarettes cause lung cancer was not entirely absent. The problem was that the tobacco industry had developed with impressive speed and coordination a strategy for managing evidence it did not like. In 1954, the major tobacco companies released what became known as the Frank Statement, a full-page advertisement acknowledging public concern and pledging to fund independent research. The pledge sounded like responsibility. It was designed to introduce doubt. At school, the teacher stops the lesson. Everyone slides out of their chairs, gets under their desks, and covers the backs of their necks with their hands. This is the duck and cover drill, and it happened regularly in American schools throughout the 1950s. The scientific basis for this was, to put it charitably, optimistic. A nuclear weapon capable of leveling a city would not be significantly deterred by a standard-issue school desk. And yet the drills continued, not because anyone in authority genuinely believed the desk would help, but because doing something, anything, felt better than telling 8-year-olds that some problems do not have solutions. The campaign was anchored by a civil defense film featuring an animated turtle named Bert. Bert the turtle, upon sensing danger, retreated into his shell. The film then applied this logic to children, suggesting that human beings could achieve a similar protective result by ducking under a desk. Children did not ask the obvious question, which was that a turtle shell is a structural component of its skeleton, and a school desk is a piece of furniture made of wood and mild steel. What the drills actually did was psychological. They normalized the idea of nuclear threat as a manageable domestic fact. This required a sustained act of collective not thinking that is genuinely impressive in retrospect. Let us go outside for a moment, past the rose bushes and the newly mowed lawn, to the slightly strange concrete structure your neighbor just had built next to his vegetable garden. That is a fallout shelter. And in 1953 America, it is not unusual. In fact, the federal government has been strongly encouraging you to build one. There are pamphlets. There are instructional films. There is a whole aesthetic of cheerful preparedness surrounding the idea of nuclear annihilation. The Federal Civil Defense Administration produced a pamphlet called Survival Under Atomic Attack, which explained with numbered steps and helpful diagrams how to protect yourself from a nuclear explosion. Key advice included lying face down, covering exposed skin, and avoiding windows. This was distributed to millions of American households as though it were a reasonable document rather than a polite fiction. Home shelters ranged from modest to elaborate. At the other end, fully constructed underground bunkers with bunk beds, ventilation systems, board games, and enough supplies to last 90 days, sold by companies that advertised in the same magazines as refrigerators and washing machines. One company offered a model it called the Family Refuge Room. It came in 3 sizes. There was a payment plan. The social dynamics of shelter ownership were predictably complicated. Did you invite your neighbors in if the bomb fell? This was debated seriously in magazines and church bulletins as an ethical question. The fact that Americans were having this conversation tells you something specific about what it felt like to live inside the decade. You wake up at 6:30, but this is not when your day begins. Your day began last night when you soaked the beans and planned the menu and checked that the good tablecloth was clean and laid out your husband's clothes so he would not have to make any decisions before coffee. You are a housewife in 1950s America, and your job, which is not called a job because it is not paid, begins before consciousness and ends after everyone else is asleep. Studies conducted at the time suggested the average housewife worked between 55 and 80 hours per week, a figure that was largely invisible because the work took place inside a building that was also supposed to be a place of leisure. Mondays were laundry. Tuesdays were ironing. Wednesdays were thorough cleaning of the main rooms. Thursdays were marketing. Fridays were for the bathrooms and the floors. Saturdays were whatever had accumulated. Sundays were for church and then the Sunday meal. What made this invisible was that its output was an absence. A clean house produced no visible product. A well-fed family was fed and then hungry again by morning. If you did it well, nobody noticed. If you did it badly, everybody did. Betty Friedan called it in 1963 the problem that has no name, a vague dissatisfaction, a restlessness, a feeling among educated women that the life they had been told was the destination was in some way they could not quite articulate not enough. The post-war era saw a remarkable rise in the prescription of tranquilizers and sedatives to American women. Miltown, introduced in 1955, became one of the best-selling drugs in American history essentially overnight. It was prescribed for anxiety, for irritability, for what doctors of the era frequently described as nervousness, a word applied to women with a frequency that should have been its own diagnosis. The advertisements for these drugs frequently featured women in domestic interiors appearing vaguely distressed and surrounded by the ordinary objects of household life. A sink full of dishes. A crying child. The drug's effect was illustrated by the same woman, same setting, now calm. The dishes were still there. The child was still there. Only her relationship to these things had changed, which was the product's value proposition stated with accidental clarity. Amphetamines, prescribed as diet pills under names like Dexedrine and Benzedrine, were widely used by women attempting to maintain the specific body shape the decade required. The 1950s silhouette was not naturally occurring. Diet pills were not on the fringe. They were in the medicine cabinets of ordinary suburban women prescribed by ordinary suburban doctors. The combination of stimulants to get through the day and sedatives to get through the night was not unusual. It was simply there in the cabinet above the sink, part of the infrastructure of an era that asked women to be several incompatible things at once. Before the 1950s, there is no teenager. There are children and then there are young adults, and the transition between them is relatively abrupt and primarily economic. The teenager as a distinct consumer category with its own music, its own fashion, its own slang, and its own television programming is a creation of post-war prosperity. For the first time, large numbers of American young people had time between childhood and adulthood, time to attend high school, time to socialize, time to form an identity, and crucially, they had money. A 16-year-old in 1955 might earn several dollars a week from a part-time job or an allowance with no rent, no groceries, and no utility bills to absorb it. That money went to record stores, to movie theaters, to clothing stores that were beginning to stock items designed specifically for people who did not want to dress like their parents. The 45 revolutions per minute single, introduced in 1949, was cheaper than an album and perfectly sized for a teenager's budget and attention span. One song, one purchase, 3 minutes of something that belonged entirely to you and not to your parents who would not understand it and were not supposed to. Elvis Presley's appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, filmed from the waist up to prevent the broadcast of his hips, is the decade's most famous instance of the adult establishment trying to manage something that had already escaped management. The hips were the point. The physicality was the point. A music that began in the body rather than the head. This was genuinely new to white middle-class America, and its newness was experienced as danger. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Wisconsin Republican with a talent for accusation and an indifference to evidence, made his name by claiming to possess lists of known communists in the State Department. Numbers that changed conveniently depending on the day and the audience. The fact that he never actually produced convincingly prosecuted communists from these lists did not immediately slow the proceedings. You did not need to be guilty of anything to have your career destroyed by association with his investigations. You needed only to have signed a petition at the wrong meeting 10 years ago, or to have attended a social event where a now suspect person was also present. The architecture of suspicion was deliberately loose, which was the point. A narrow definition of disloyalty was manageable and finite. A broad one kept everyone afraid. The entertainment industry was a particular target. The House Un-American Activities Committee had been investigating Hollywood since the late 1940s, and by the early 50s, the blacklist was a functioning institution. Writers, directors, and actors who refused to cooperate found themselves unable to work. Some careers ended completely. Some people left the country. Some cooperated and named names and spent the rest of their lives managing what that had cost them. McCarthy's eventual undoing was, in an irony perfectly suited to the decade, television. During the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, broadcast live, millions of Americans watched him operate in real time and found the experience clarifying. When attorney Joseph Welch turned to him and said, in a voice of real exhaustion, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" The country watching at home fell silent. There is a man on your street. There is always a man on your street whose lawn is perfect. It is the green of something that does not occur in nature, striped in alternating directions with a precision suggesting geometry homework, edged along the sidewalk with what must be surgical instruments. He is out there every Saturday. He is watching your lawn when you cannot see him. In 1950 suburban America, the lawn is not grass. It is character. The condition of your yard is a public statement about your values, your work ethic, your respect for the neighborhood, and the structural soundness of your marriage. When every yard is the same size and shape, the variables that remain are entirely about effort and judgment. Your lawn, therefore, was not your lawn. It was your score. Crabgrass was the enemy. Dandelions were a moral failing. The chemical industry supplied herbicides and pesticides with names that sounded like authority, applied to residential lawns in quantities that, in retrospect, warrant a careful look at where all of that went. A lawn that went unmowed for 2 weekends generated comment. A third weekend generated a visit. By the fourth, the visit came with a casserole, which was both neighborly and a communication. The man with the perfect lawn was not simply a good gardener. He was a man who was in control of his property, which meant he was in control of his circumstances, which meant he was the right kind of neighbor. On a Saturday afternoon in the suburbs, smoke rises from approximately every third yard. The backyard barbecue. A man who does not cook stands in front of a large metal apparatus that costs more than a bedroom set and prepares meat in a manner that requires no particular skill, but which is discussed with the intensity of a surgical consultation. Cooking on an open flame is primitive and therefore masculine, whereas cooking on a stove involves appliances and planning and is therefore domestic and therefore feminine. Never mind that both processes involve the application of heat to food in a controlled environment. The grill was coded masculine by virtue of its outdoor location, its connection to fire, and the speed with which it destroyed evidence of its inadequacy. A steak cooked badly on a grill produces charcoal, which is not subject to the same critical evaluation as a steak cooked badly in a pan. The Weber kettle grill, introduced in 1952, was a hemispherical design that controlled airflow and temperature with considerably more precision than the flat open braziers it was replacing. It cost more. It looked more serious. What the backyard barbecue celebrated underneath its smoke and its paper plates was the specific freedom of owning a backyard. Standing at your grill, on your grass, behind your fence on a Saturday afternoon in 1957, with the neighbors on either side doing approximately the same thing, that was the dream made literal. The steak was slightly overcooked, but everything else was exactly right. And so here you are at the end of a single day in 1950s America. A day that began with cream rising to the top of a glass bottle on your doorstep and ended with the glow of a television set casting its particular gray light across a living room arranged specifically to receive it. You have eaten things suspended in gelatin. You have mowed a lawn for reasons that were never entirely about the grass. You have sat under a desk at school and called it preparation. It was a strange decade to live inside. Confident on the surface in a way that required considerable maintenance, abundant in ways that were real and unequal in ways that were equally real and considerably less discussed. A decade that built fallout shelters in the backyard and called them prudence. That prescribed tranquilizers to unhappy women and called it medicine. That told its children to hide under their desks and called it safety. And yet the people who lived in it were not performing contentment into a void. The family around the television on a Tuesday evening was actually together. The neighbors arriving at the backyard barbecue actually knew each other's names. The children on the street until the streetlights came on were actually free in the specific way that only comes from hours with no agenda and nowhere particular to be. So tonight, as you pull your blanket up and let the day go quiet around you, maybe spare a gentle thought for the woman who smiled at the refrigerator, not because she was fooled, but because she was trying. And for the man on the street with a perfect lawn, who was doing the only thing the decade had told him to do with his particular kind of love. History is rarely as simple as it looks from one end of it. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe. Leave a comment with a topic you would like to hear next. Good night.